So last week we were in Damascus, and this week we're going to be in Baghdad. So Baghdad is the capital of the Republic of Iraq, located on the banks of the Tigris River, has a population of about 7 million, 75% of which is Shia Muslim. Iraq is a Shia-dominant country. And we'll see the irony in the fact that Saddam Hussein was a Sunni. It was just the reverse in Syria. Remember, it was a Sunni-dominated population with a Shia leader. In any case, so on the map here, hopefully you can see where Baghdad is. So it really doesn't come into the light of history until about 762. About the 8th century. Before that, there wasn't really much there. That's when the Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mansur, decided to found his capital here. So this was a city that was just built from pretty much scratch by this Abbasid Caliph. The Abbasids were the caliphate that followed the Umayyads. I've mentioned the Umayyads several times. That was the first caliphate. It existed a couple decades after the death of Muhammad, and it was centered in Damascus, in Syria. After a couple hundred years, it began to decline, and another caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, came to power. And this Al-Mansur decides he needs a new capital. They'd had 4 previous capitals, and he decided to build a capital from scratch. There had been settlements there. We have records going back to the 7th century BCE, that there were some small settlements. And at one time in the 6th century CE, there were a group of Nestorian monks living there. The Nestorians were an element of Syrian Christianity, Eastern Christianity, who were seen as heretical. I think I mentioned last time, one of the big issues that divided a lot of the churches was the nature of Christ. Okay, and the Nestorians had a very I don't want to go into all the details, it doesn't really matter, but they were seen as not having the right view. And so they were actually excommunicated by the majority of the Eastern Church. So like I said, before Al-Mansur decided to have his capital here, they'd had 4 different capitals. He needed a capital that was within, at the time, what was called Persia. Now, at this time, Iran and Iraq were not divided. There was no country called Iraq at this time. There was just the Persian Empire, and the Abbasids controlled it. And he wanted it within that area, but he also wanted it far enough away from certain Arab garrisons who still supported the Umayyads to make sure that there were not any attacks. So that's why he located it in Baghdad and commissioned the construction of the city. He believed it was the perfect city to be the capital of the caliphate. He brought engineers, surveyors, artists from around the Islamic world. And it was called the Round City because it was built in a round manner. 2 large semicircles separated by a variety of walls. And it led to in the middle, I don't know if you can you see in the middle of the picture on the left? That was called the Golden Gate Palace. The diagram on the right has a little knob in the middle. So that's right in the middle of the circle was the palace. And the city was built in this very interesting circular manner. It was 200, the palace was 200 square yards, and it's no longer there today. It was destroyed by the Mongols, and we'll see when the Mongols come in. So within a short period of time, Baghdad became not only the political nucleus of the caliphate at its political center, but the center of learning and commerce. The House of Wisdom, which was created there, was an intellectual center dedicated to the translation of Greek, Persian, and Syriac works. And where it's interesting, it was because of these translations, which centuries later will come to the West, that we know anything about a lot of early Greek philosophy, science. Because during the so-called Dark Ages, that was just in the West, those were just cast aside. We did have a number of manuscripts that were kept, interestingly enough, in monasteries, but it was really the Muslims who allowed, and some historians will argue that the Muslims were really one of the backbones of the Renaissance, because it was that Greek learning that returned during that period. But this was called the House of Wisdom. Scholars from all over the empire came here to study, and you've heard of this, the 1001 Nights, the tales. This was written there. Most of the stories are set in Baghdad at that time. So by the early 10th century, I bet you most people don't know this, Baghdad was the largest city in the world, with well over 1 million inhabitants. 10th century. See, we don't generally, from my background in education, especially in high school, we don't study anything besides European and maybe American history. And if you want to take, maybe now they have an elective, but these are world histories are very, things do fit together. It's really hard to understand one part of the world without seeing the connections, and there are connections. But by the middle of the 10th century, so this is interesting because it had sort of reached its peak, and this is often what happens, reach its peak, start to decline. So that by the middle of the 10th, it was in decline, and for the next 3 centuries, it was ruled by a number of weak caliphs or their subordinates, and it just really declined in population, in power. And then it really got the axe on February 10th, 1258. Captured by the Mongols, led by Hulegu, who was the grandson of Genghis Khan. Now, if you know anything about Mongol history, they didn't take any prisoners. And Baghdad was decimated. Most of the city's inhabitants, including the caliph, were killed. Large parts of the city were destroyed, including the palace that I mentioned. And many thought it signaled the Armageddon from a Muslim. But Muslims, and I'll be talking about Muslim eschatology down the line, but Muslims have the notion of the end of the world, just like Christians do. And many say, well, this must be it, because the chronicles just record, piles of skulls, and it was just a real devastation. So it was ruled by what was known as the Ilkhanate, which was a sub-state of the Mughal Empire, until 1401. So for well over 150 years, the Mongols ruled. And then over the next 150 years, it became a provincial capital controlled by several local powers until it was finally captured by the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks. But the Ottomans weren't really interested in Baghdad too much, so under their rule, it sort of fell into another period of decline for 2 centuries. It was there, but it wasn't considered a major city in the Ottoman Empire. But then, starting in the 1850s, it began to recover. Advances were made in commerce, transportation, communication, and consequently, by 1907. It was again a prosperous city. But then the Ottoman Empire entered World War I in August of 1914 on the side of the Central Powers, that's Germany and Austria. But as the tide of the war turned in March of 1917, the British finally took Baghdad. A little interesting story. My grandfather was part of the British Army invasion of Iraq at that time. It was called Mesopotamia, the Mesopotamian campaign. He was wounded in a battle before they took Baghdad was R&R'd back to India, and that's where he stayed for the rest of his career. That's where my mother was born. That's where I was born. So if it's not for this war, I'm not here. It's interesting to look at connections that way. Sometimes the things you think that are really bad, if you say, I wish that hadn't happened, then everything else that followed on from that can't happen either. So take that one home and play with it for a while. So anyway, they took Baghdad. But during the conflict, I think I had mentioned this before, Britain had negotiated with Sharif Hussein of Mecca. He was one of the tribal leaders who was in control of the holy city of Mecca. They promised him independence to an Arab province, including parts of Iraq, in return for his support against the Ottomans. And if you've seen Lawrence of Arabia, that's what's going on. They're fighting the Ottoman troops because that was part of the Saudi Arabia. Arabia was part of the Ottoman Empire. And I've mentioned this before, so this will be a question that is on the final, because I've mentioned it 3 times, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So while behind the scenes they were making promises, and perhaps I should have mentioned, in Arab culture, a verbal promise was a man's word. You didn't have to have it in writing. Well, as it turned out down the line, when Hussein he said, well, where's your treaty? And he didn't have one. He was just promised it. In any case, so the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as we've seen before, resulted in this part of the Ottoman Empire being divided between the French and the British. The French got Syria and Lebanon. The British got Iraq and Palestine as part of what was called a mandate. So they were now in control of the region. Right after the war, a group of Arab delegates met in Damascus and denounced the mandate, which you might think is reasonable, and declared Iraq's independence under one of Sharif Hussein's sons. However, the British refused to recognize the resolution, and in 1921 installed another tribal leader, Faisal I, as king, but client ruler. What's a client? Someone who works for you. He was king, sort of given the title, but the British were in control. So it was this is how the British, they operated this way in Egypt as well. They allowed for there to be a monarch, but behind the scenes, they held the political power. And the monarch really couldn't do anything against British wishes. So there was radical opposition. They wanted complete independence. So between 1921 and 28, there were a series of insurrections, rebellions, sort of similar to what we've seen in Iraq not too long ago. And the Minister of War at that time was one Winston Churchill. And we have his letters, and he was saying, this place is a pain in the ass. We need to get out. We need to get out. So the British were prepared to end the mandate as long as British interests were maintained. So this led to a treaty, the 1930 Anglo-Iraqi Treaty. It was a 25-year alliance during which both countries agreed to consult on significant issues related to foreign policy. And the consulting was, well, we understand that. Finally, independence was granted in 1932. So the British leave. But there continued to be Iraqi opposition to the new government by factions who believed the country was still under British control, although not officially. You know, you can do things, what do they call it, back channel? So there was a lot of, again, discontent politically. Well, Faisal died in 1933, and he was succeeded by his son Ghazi, who was a playboy. He loved fast cars and fast, well, you can, and he died in a car accident. And finally, in July of 1958, officers from the 19th Brigade of the Iraqi Army, called the Free Officers, under the leadership of this General Brigadier Abdul Qasim, overthrew the monarchy. So the monarchy was overthrown. King Faisal II was king at the time. He was executed in the palace gardens. His body, along with many others of the royal family, displayed in public. And a new republic was proclaimed in Baghdad. So now we have a republic as the new government. This is interesting. The military elements in the Middle East at this time were, we had Nasser in Egypt, we had Ataturk in Turkey. They are opposed to much of traditional Middle Eastern system. They want to modernize. They want to westernize. They want strong military. They're very much opposed to the extremist elements in Islam. All three of those leaders were anything but religious. So it looked like for a period of time, these military dictatorships were going to actually take over and change the Middle East. So the trouble was they didn't, at least in Iraq, the government didn't, there were a lot of factions. There were a lot of different elements competing, and the military was continually having to put down these various elements. And Qasim ends up being assassinated by a member of the Ba'ath Party, B-A-A-T-H. This was a secularist party, socialist party, that originated in Syria, and Saddam was one of the early lieutenants who went up the ranks and eventually became the president and supreme leader of Iraq. It espoused an ideology of Arab nationalism, socialism, and anti-imperialist interests, as well as anti-fundamentalism. So the Secretary General, as I said, Saddam Hussein, became president in 1979. Although technically a Sunni Muslim, remember the population, 75% Shia, he created a Western-style legal system. He didn't go by the Sharia, making Iraq the only country in the Persian Gulf that didn't rule by traditional Sharia law. To the consternation of Islamic conservatives, he turned Baghdad into a modern city. We gave women high-level jobs in government and industry, as well as freedom of dress. These were women in Iraq in the 1980s. His rule, however, was fairly heavy-handed. He allowed no vocal opposition. And to maintain power, he took repressive measures against the Shia majority and the Kurd minority in the north. These were the two groups that he feared. And you can see why he might fear the Shia. They have 75% of the population. It's this interesting balance, and I'm going to raise a question later that I want you to take home and think about as regarding Saddam Hussein. In any case, in September of 1980, during the latter part of the Iran hostage crisis, remember that with Jimmy Carter? Saddam invaded Iran with the backing of U.S. support. Got to remember that for later. They actually provided him with logistics and weapons. Why? Because Iran was the enemy. Again, keep these in mind. This Iraq-Iran connection Very interesting. Even today, if things were different, anyway, we'll get to that. So, the war lasted 8 years and ended in a stalemate, although it did much damage to Iraqi society and Iranian society. Very, very sad. The graveyards just filled up with a lot of young boys, too. The Iranians were offering paradise for young boys who went out into the minefields to have the mines explode so that the other forces behind could go ahead. And Saddam used gas, and it was not a nice war. Are any wars nice? I guess. Yeah. So it finally comes to a peace treaty, but nobody gained anything. I think Iraq might have gotten 100 yards or something, just some very small amount of territory after 8 years of slaughter. So 2 years later, now we're getting a little closer, you may remember this, August of 1990, Saddam invaded Kuwait. Why did he do that? He claimed, and there's some historical evidence for this, that Kuwait was originally part of Iraq, and that the British had separated it for their own personal interests. So he was claiming to just be taking back what was Iraq's. Anyway, as you know, I created what we call the first Gulf War, in which Bush the First, really, Saddam's forces were easily defeated. Following the war, there was a rebellion by Shia elements in the south, and Saddam reacted by brutally putting them down in their uprising. This is another interesting question, because if you can perhaps remember, the Shia thought they were going to get U.S. support, because President Bush had sort of said, why don't you guys get rid of him? He had openly, publicly stated that. Now, if a government states that, you can assume you might, but that didn't happen. And the Shia were pretty much slaughtered. And then he also had rebellion in the north by the Kurds, and he used gas against them. So there was the Shia uprising, which was put down brutally, and the use of gas against the Kurds. So then, based on claims, now we're getting closer to contemporary history, so you'll remember some of this, that the regime had weapons of mass destruction. On March 19, 2003, a combined force of troops from the United States and a number of allies invaded and toppled the government. Remember, it was called shock and awe. And there's this famous picture of Saddam's statue being torn down. Although mission was accomplished, the war was followed by a period of social chaos, if you can remember, including looting, intra-religious violence between Shia and Sunni, in which thousands were killed. And there were examples of ethnic cleansing on both sides. Then there was this famous event, which led to even more violence. It was this destruction by Sunni radicals of the great mosque of Samarra. Why was that mosque important? To Shia Muslims, this is the mosque from which the young last imam was raised up after he died. If you remember this, the Shia believe in the hidden imam who will return at the end. He was the 12th in this line of imams. It was that mosque that was sacred to Shia because that was where he was supposedly raised. And that's what happened to it. And you can imagine, I mean, tensions were high enough, and the Shia responded brutally. There was pretty much an ethnic cleansing of Baghdad. My friend Juan Cole, who teaches at the University of Michigan, professor of Islamic studies, did a study. They figure that over 50% of the Baghdad population, which was Sunni, was driven out. Where did they go? Well, they went up near Fallujah, up in the north, which was Sunni. You remember Fallujah, the Battle of Fallujah, up into that? And then many of them ended going to Syria. Refugees went to Syria. In any case, it was a very chaotic time. With U.S. support, a largely Shia government was established. So they had elections. Well, there was that period where the U.S. was there as occupy, the transition, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. Eventually, the government is handed over. Elections take place. If you have 75% of the population, who do you think is going to control the government? And this created and continues. You don't hear about it much these days because we focus on one thing, how our news cycles work. But there's continual problems even today in Iraq with sometimes Sunni minority groups striking out against the Shia majority. Okay, there was an 8-year occupation, and that was followed by the new government. Saddam was found and was executed. He was hanged. And then the United States exited December 2021, not too long ago. Although there are about 2,500 troops still remaining, basically in the green zone, which I'll talk about in a moment, but handing over the government. And we must remember, Iraq being a Shia country, what's right next door? The big Shia country, Iran. They're like its little brother. How do you think Iraq lines up politically today with Iran? Would that make any difference if that were not the case today?
Probably.
Yeah. Interesting to think of anyway, we'll get to that later. What was really gained by getting rid of Saddam Hussein? So those who were brutalized, yes, you can see how, but overall, politically, geopolitically, because as Machiavelli's taught long ago, you always want your enemy to have an enemy on their border. You see why? You don't want, because if they've got an ally, well, then their influence just spreads. In any case, so we're going to start our tour, and the Baghdad tour will not only involve visits to some of the city's most important sites, we're also going to go down to two of the holy cities, Karbala and Najaf, because you can't really know much about Iraq unless you know something about the holy shrines at Karbala and Iraq. So let's start in Baghdad with the National Museum of Iraq. After World War I, archaeologists from Europe and the United States began several excavations throughout Iraq to try and preserve antiquities. Now remember, Iraq used to be called Mesopotamia. When you study ancient history, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, and a lot of that is still there, and they wanted it preserved. And the person who was very active in that, has anyone heard of Gertrude Bell? She was an archaeologist, and they wanted to keep these treasures in Iraq because there were a lot of people stealing them and taking them away, including Western countries. And she was a British traveler, an archaeologist, an intelligence agent, and author. And she began collecting the artifacts in a government building, just a small building, in Baghdad in 1922. And in 1926, the Iraqi government moved the collection to a new building and established what was the Baghdad Antiquities Museum. And she was the director. Unfortunately, she died a year later. But if it were not for Gertrude Bell, we would not have this great museum today. So in 1966, the collection was moved again to about a 500,000 square foot building that you saw earlier on the east side of the Tigris River. And its name was changed to the National Museum of Iraq. Its collection includes numerous artifacts from Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, Assyrian civilizations. If you love the ancient Middle East, This is a museum for you. At least it was. Following the 2003 invasion, no one guarded it. No one guarded the museum. It was looted. People just went in and took a lot of the stuff that could be taken. Just give you an example of three. Oh, there's the interior. There's this famous piece called the Warqa vase, a Sumerian alabaster piece more than 5,000 years old. It was stolen. It was later returned, so this is one they got back. Then there was this headless statue of Etamina of Lagash, 2400 BCE. Didn't get it back, as far as I know. Then this beautiful harp of Ur, 2500 BCE, which was, they got it back, but they didn't get the gold inlay. The gold was taken out. So anyway, it was a very chaotic period during the, you may remember, there was just no control. The army had been defeated, and Saddam's army had fled, and there was no one. It would be like if all of a sudden tomorrow LA had no police. Do you think we'd be all right? No, probably not. There'd be a lot of looting. In any case, so it's been able to reestablish itself since independence, but they lost a lot of good stuff. So our next site is known as the Al-Mustansereyya Madrasa. A madrasa was a school, largely a religious school. It's one of the oldest Islamic institutions of higher learning in the world. It was established in 1227. Now, not that building. Okay. As a madrasa by the Abbasid Caliph. The Abbasids that was a very dynamic civilization. Much learning took place. And so it was the center of the intellectual world for centuries. And this was one of the main centers of learning. To give you an example, its library had a collection of 400,000 volumes. It survived the Mongol sack of 1258 and was restored. But after the Ottomans captured Baghdad in 1534, books from the library were taken back to Istanbul. So it was looted by the Ottomans. And it really sort of died as an institution from that point on. That's a picture of the gate of that madrasa. Notice the fine stucco work. So today it's just sort of a museum piece. There's only one Abbasid palace that's left in the city. It's believed to have been built by the Caliph al-Nasir al-Dinala, 1179 to 1225. Central courtyard, 2 stories of rooms with beautiful arches and facade against stucco. The work on it is really fantastic. Okay, going to leave the central city to go out to a couple very important sites in the suburbs. In Al-Khadimiya, can you see on the map? Can you see where Al-Khadimiya is on the map? It's a little bit north of this main city. North, up and to your left, it says Al-Khadimiya, it's a suburb. Here we find the Al-Khadimiya Mosque and Shrine. It contains the tombs of the 7th and 9th Shia Imams. Remember who the Imams were. The Imams were the successors of Muhammad. It was his line through his cousin Ali and his daughter Fatima. Ali was the first Imam. Hussein, who was martyred, was the second. And it went through 12, and the 12th was believed to have been. So these are very significant individuals, and the tombs of these 7th and 9th Imams are found inside this, this famous mosque. There's also the tomb of one Sheikh Nasr ad-Din Tusi from the 13th century. Who was he? He was a great author and writer. He wrote over 1,500 separate works, representing one of the largest collection of any single Islamic author in all of history. He wrote in Arabic and Persian. He dealt with not only religious topics, but he wrote about Euclid, so he wrote about mathematics, Ptolemy, so he wrote about geography. He was what we would call a Renaissance man of his time. He could write on just about anything. His tomb is inside as well. So, when the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur started the construction of the round city of Baghdad, this area of Al-Khadimiya was a cemetery for his family. It was the family cemetery, that whole suburb. The tombs of the Imams were located here, but they were just separate small tombs. And then at the beginning of the 16th century, they were housed in this newly constructed mosque, which over the following centuries has been repaired a number of times.
Is that gold inlaid?
Yeah, they don't go when you're celebrating your Imams, you don't go cheap. And this is the tomb of one of those Imams.
Are those clothes hanging?
They're not clothes, they're kind of drapery, ornamental drapery. What would we call it if you put on top of a casket? Or is there a word for that?
Yeah, I can't think of it.
Yeah, I think there is a word for it. Yeah, I can't remember. The other mosque is the Anu, and this is in another suburb. It's in the suburb called Al-Adamiya. Can you see that? It's a little more to the right. It's one of those. This is a Sunni mosque. The one we just saw was a Shia mosque. This is a Sunni mosque, and it's the most prominent Sunni mosque in Baghdad. It's known as the Abu Hanifa Mosque, named after Abu Hanifa. So who was Abu Hanifa? He's also known as, now this is where you can get terms mixed up, he's called the Great Imam, but a Sunni Imam is not the same thing as a Shia Imam. A Sunni Imam is just a leader of the faithful, sometimes in prayer or just in legalistic matters. Well, he was a great legalist. He was the founder of the most conservative school of Islamic jurisprudence. There are 4 major schools of Sharia that go from extremely conservative to more or less liberal. Okay? He was the author of the most extreme conservative school. It happens to have the largest number of Sunni followers. It's predominant in countries that were part of the Ottoman Empire. To give you an example of how extreme it is, it's in this school of jurisprudence that apostasy is punishable by death. What is apostasy? If you're an apostate, you give up your religion. You say, I no longer believe. So if you were to convert to Christianity, for example, this is not Quranic. I want to remind you of that. This was later interpretation. You don't find that in the Quran. Quran speaks well of all people the people of the books, by the way. In any case, he died in 767, and the town grew up around him and has become very famous. In 1066, the mosque was restored with a large dome and a minaret. And then, and I don't know what year this happened, but it's interesting. Can you see what that is? It's a clock. It's a clock tower that was added to. Well, at least you know when it's time to pray if you're close by. But you should hear the muezzin anyway, so that doesn't make any sense. So. Now here's his tomb. No, sorry. Here's the interior. Do you notice anything different about this? It's much more simplistic. This is Sunni. Shia tombs are very elaborate. And this has been one reason Sunnis condemn them. They say you treat your imams better than you treat Muhammad. You've made the imams like your gods, etc., etc. So this is a much more simple.
Is that stonework around it, or is that...
It's a grate-like, sort of metal grate, yeah. In the eastern part of the city is a suburb called Sadr City. It's a sprawling area of impoverishment, some would say slum, built in 1959 by Abdul Qasim when they overthrew the monarchy, and unofficially named Sadr City after the Shia Ayatollah Muhammad Sadek al-Sadr. In Shia Islam, your highest rank of leaders are called Ayatollahs. You've probably heard of the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. There are Ayatollahs also in Iraq. He was one of the highest Ayatollahs, and this city was named after him. It was a housing project for mainly Shia with over 1 million people in it. During the occupation, that's when the U.S. forces were in, it became known as the home of the Mahdi Army. It's a slum. Saddam put no money into this. He put no money into Sadr City. Do you remember this gentleman? He was very significant during the early years of occupation. He led the Mahdi Army, which was a Shia militia, which fought against both Americans and Sunni militias. So during that whole period of chaos, he was the leader. So this is al-Sadr, and he was the 4th son of the Ayatollah. So that's why he held such high standing. Okay, so returning to go back to the central city, just some of the old city architecture. You can see the European influence. And we're going to stop by the Armenian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest churches in Baghdad, also known as the Church of the Virgin Mary, which shouldn't surprise us, first built in 1640 by the Armenians on land granted to them by the Ottoman Sultan. It was reconstructed in 1967. So that's a few words about the Armenians, because this is the Armenian community. This is interesting. During the 1980s, they flourished as a result of their support for President Saddam Hussein. Saddam retained many Armenians among his personal entourage. His nanny was an Iraqi Armenian, along with his bodyguards, his jeweler, his tailor, and one of his mistresses. So the Armenians benefited under this relatively secular rule of the Ba'ath Party. They were allowed to freely worship, no problem. They didn't support any opposition. They were loyal. During Christmas, Saddam would order large amounts of flowers to be taken to the church. A little different image of the guy. However, with the invasion of Iraq, the situation for the Armenians changed considerably. Armenians have been subject to killings and kidnappings for ransom because they've been identified with the arch enemy of the revolution, Saddam Hussein. They supported him. As a result, many Armenians have migrated to other Middle Eastern countries, Europe, US, Canada, Australia. Big Armenian population in Glendale, where I grew up. So a short distance from the church is the Al-Khulafa Mosque. And I'm not going to take you in. What's important about this mosque is its minaret. It's the only remaining piece from the original mosque, which was constructed in the 10th century. So that minaret is dated from the 10th century. When that mosque was burned to the ground by the Mongols, that's all that remained, that minaret. So in the 1960s, the government commissioned the new mosque that then incorporated. There was just the minaret standing there for a long period. They decided to build a new mosque. So on the west bank of the Tigris is located the Green Zone. Does that name ring a bell at all? The most common name for the international zone of Baghdad. It's a basically 4 square mile area that is the center of international presence. This is where you'll find the embassies. And it was considered the most secure area of the city. During the occupation, this was where the American forces were, by and large. And you'd hear it was supposed to be really safe, but periodically you'd hear something happened in the Green Zone. Within the Green Zone was the Republican Presidential Palace. It was constructed in the 1950s by King Faisal II, the young king who was assassinated during the overthrow of the monarchy. Saddam Hussein's office was located here. Now, he had numerous palaces. You may remember, before the actual invasion, they were trying to think, well, how can we knock this guy out? And he's probably going to be, but he constantly moved. It was said he was never in one place more than a couple nights. And he would go to his different palaces just to. Can you see the 2 heads? These are heads of Saddam the warrior. The palace was surrounded by Republican Guard military camps and apartment blocks for his supporters. The United States spared the palace during its shock and awe raids, probably because they knew they could use it, or the new government would be able to use it, and that they did. It served as the headquarters for the American occupation in Iraq. This is just a picture of the dining hall. Do you see what's on the wall? It looks like weaponry, right? Just to remind you who has the power. And you see what's below it? It's almost like a throne. That's where he would often sit. So continuing into the district of Al-Mansur, we come to what was known as the Hands of Victory Monument, also known as the Arc of Triumph, or the Hands of Victory. It's a pair of triumphal arches. There's the ones that's close by, and then you see down the parade ground there's another. So it's a pair. Each arch consists of a pair of hands holding crossed swords. What do you think this was? It was a parade ground. It was a military parade ground to celebrate Saddam's military prowess, even though they didn't win the Iran-Iraq war. When you lose a war, you generally try and present it as a win. So the two arches mark the two entrances of what is known as the Great Celebration Square, and the parade ground constructed to commemorate the Iran-Iraq war, even though the war was not won. It sits aside this park, a very famous park in Baghdad, the Zahra Park, which actually has a zoo connected to it. And you may remember, after the invasion, there was no one to take care of any of the animals. Many of them were escaping, and they were running all over the city, and many were shot or died. And the zoo, everything. When that invasion took place, the whole city came apart. There was no way to control anything, no means of control. It's hard to imagine a city in a situation like that. So whoever has the guns, in any case. Finally we go to the Baghdad Tower. There's a revolving restaurant on top. It's an observation deck. It's located on the top floor. After the 2003 invasion, the tower was occupied by American soldiers. Yeah, why not? Yeah, it's good. Yeah, have a good suite up there. Finally, just want to mention one last mosque before we go down to Karbala and Najaf. This is known as the Al-Rahman Mosque. That means the most merciful, which was intended to be one of the largest mosques in Iraq. Why do I say intended? It was never finished. It's not far from the Baghdad Tower. Construction was begun by Saddam in 1998, but the work was cut short during the 2003 invasion and was never completed. It's interesting, if you can see, its main unfinished dome, can you see the main dome? Is surrounded by 8 smaller independent domes, which in turn feature 8 even smaller domes. They're all integrated together. It would have been a magnificent, and the government has not had the funds to rebuild it.
Having all of those domes, you've got a lot more worshipers?
Yeah, I think it's just aesthetic and, different. You don't find another mosque like this. And here's a view of it from the Baghdad Tower. Okay, we're going to go down to the 2 holy cities. First, Karbala. See on the map where Baghdad is? And you can see Karbala just to the south, 62 miles southwest of Baghdad. Has an estimated population of about 650,000. So as cities go, not big. It's best known as the location of the Battle of Karbala, which I think I mentioned last week, where the Imam Hussein, grandson of the Prophet, was killed in battle by the forces of the Sunni Caliph. His head was taken to Damascus, put on a pole, and the rest of his family were marched there. I think we had some stories about that last week. So this is the spot. Karbala, the city, grew up around where that battlefield was. It's one of the holiest cities for Shia Muslims, not only in Iraq, but anywhere in the world, including Iran. Literally millions of pilgrims from Iran come here every year. About Karbala, it was said, where your grandson and his family will be killed is the most blessed and most sacred land on earth, and is one of the valleys of paradise. That's from a Shia perspective. This is where your Imam was killed. This is where he was sacrificed, where he was murdered. So it becomes a very sacred city. So it's made up of two districts. There's the old city. It's like any other old city in the Middle East with shops, lining the streets that look like they all need repair, to a very modern elements of the city. So I don't want you to get the idea that these cities are all ancient. I mean, they have their modern sectors. I've just been focusing on the religious and cultural sites, which don't tend to be high-rise buildings. That's only in the United States, where we think our high-rise buildings are our cultural. In any case, and I'll say in some elements of Europe. I don't want to pick on the U.S. But this is what it's known for. This is what it's known for. It's the center of the old city is the Imam Hussein shrine, containing the tomb of the Imam Hussein. His tomb became a place of pilgrimage shortly after his death. There wasn't a shrine there, obviously, because the Shia didn't have any control. But they hid his body. They were able to hide his body. And then they began to make pilgrimages to Karbala, not to the shrine at first, but just to where his body was said to be located. Then a small shrine was built. And this pilgrimage for Shias is considered equal to the Hajj. If you go on pilgrimage to Karbala, that's the equivalent of going to Mecca. And as you may know, one of the pillars of Islam, if you can afford it, is to make one pilgrimage during your lifetime to Mecca. Well, this takes the place of that for Shia Muslims. The tomb and its annexes were destroyed by the Sunni Caliph in 850 and 851, and pilgrimage was prohibited, but a new shrine was built the following century. So it's been destroyed a number of times. The shrine gates open into a large courtyard.
During the pilgrimage, about how many people come?
Millions. I'll show you a picture in a moment. This is a shrine, the door, the entrance door. The tomb is located directly below the Golden Dome. Within the shrine can also be found a grave of all 72 Karbala martyrs, those of his close companions. They're buried in a mass grave which is at the foot of his tomb. The graves of his sons, Ali al-Akbar and Ali al-Asghar, are also buried in the shrine. So you can see why it's a very holy spot. As mentioned last week, Hussein's martyrdom is memorialized yearly as the days of Ashura, which includes, for some, flagellation. Now, this is generally restricted to males of a certain age. Why are they doing this? They're identifying with the Imam Hussein. They're taking on his bleeding. You find something a little bit similar in the Philippines with Christianity, where sometimes during Easter, they will go up on a cross, and sometimes will even have nails driven in. It's a bit of an extreme. What it's all about is identifying with the martyred Imam. And when you do that, you're spiritually purified because you, in a sense, become him. It's like a type of communion. You become one with the Imam. It's not supposed to be accepted by the government, but the government doesn't do anything about it. And it's an age-old tradition. So it's only one aspect of Ashura. The Ashura lasts about a week. There you go. Few people come. It's known as the Aberdeen pilgrimage. Millions of pilgrims visit Karbala, making it one of the largest religious gatherings in the world. Equivalent almost to Mecca in the numbers that come. Pilgrims travel for miles, walking from Basra to Karbala. Basra's down right at the Gulf there, the southern coast of Iraq. That's where the military landed when they invaded Iraq. They land their troops in Basra, and then they marched up Iraq. So pilgrims will march from Basra all the way to Karbala.
Do they have any shelters for them?
Well, yeah. This is just part of it. It's nothing like the 10 cities but what happens, as I understand it, is many of the Karbala residents take people in for this period of time. It's seen as almost a religious obligation. Right across from the shrine is this mosque. It's the mosque to Hussein's brother, who was also killed at Karbala. It's known as the Al-Abbas Mosque. And I guess it's where his brother is buried, and it's, again, a memorial for the Battle of Karbala. Interestingly, the distance between the shrine and the mosque is the exact same as two hills in Mecca that the pilgrims walk between. So what happens is this is sort of a replacement for Mecca. People will go from the shrine to the mosque, back to the shrine, worshiping at each spot. So that's Karbala. Now there's another holy city, and that's Najaf. You see where that is? That's a little further south, roughly 40 miles south of Karbala. Like Karbala, Najaf is considered a holy site for Shia Muslims and a center of pilgrimage, as the city is the home to the Imam Ali shrine. This was the first Imam, the Imam who was married to Fatima, and from the line from which all Imams follow. He was the first Shia Imam. It is said he was born in the sacred sanctuary of the Kaaba. Who knows? Again, like I said, often it doesn't matter what was, is what people believe. I mean, if millions of people believe that in itself has some sense of power. So that's where he was believed. It is said that when Muhammad reported receiving divine revelation, Ali was first male to accept the message. He was only 12. And one of the first converts to Islam. Actually, the first convert was his wife, Khadija, who was a very, very powerful, significant, important businesswoman. She ran the major caravan company in Mecca. And she hired Muhammad as a young man. He proved himself on those caravan routes, which were very dangerous, by the way. And she married him. And when he had his first revelation, she supported him. Because according to tradition, after he had that first revelation, he came home and said, I'm going mad. There's a jinn after me. A jinn is like an evil spirit. And he told her about it. She said, no, this sounds legit. I think the God is speaking to you. So it's interesting that it was a woman, both financially, psychologically, and spiritually, that gave him support. I think it's just an interesting fact to remember when you start talking about things like this. Okay. In Medina, Muhammad gave his daughter Fatima to Ali in marriage. And after his death, Ali's claim to leadership met with defiance, which eventually led to war. And in 661, he was attacked one morning while praying in the great mosque of Al-Kufa and died 2 days later. So another assassinated imam. The shrine was first built in 977. After being destroyed by fire, it was rebuilt in 1086 and again in 1500. Over the centuries, numerous hospices, schools, libraries, Sufi convents have been built around the shrine. It's almost like a little city in itself, sort of like a Vatican city. Yep. And again, it's the center of Shia learning and theology. During the uprising of 1991, following the first Gulf War, that was when George Bush I defeated Saddam Hussein, and then there was the rebellion by the Shia. This Saddam Hussein's Republican guards damaged the shrine. And they killed a large number of Shia in the process. Afterwards, the shrine was closed for 2 years. The shrine is known for its gold-gilded dome. I don't know if you remember, but as American troops were coming up, they passed through Najaf. And there was one, this was on TV, I can remember seeing it, and there was one small patrol group that were going by the shrine and started to enter the gates. They were quickly told, no, don't come. It's a good thing they didn't, and they bypassed it. Tradition holds that within the shrine are also the remains of Adam and Noah. The Najaf Seminary is one of the most important teaching centers in the Islamic world. Anybody worth their anything in Islamic theology will have studied at Najaf, including the Ayatollah Khomeini. All the main Ayatollahs have studied at Najaf. It is the center of Islamic Shia theology. He studied there between 1964 and 1978. So when I say study there, you're not going there for a few months to study. Okay, that's how many years? 14 years. It's also the home of the world's largest cemetery. Wadi al-Salam. It's said to contain the tombs of a number of prophets and many of the devoted Shia from around the world. If you can be buried here as a Shia, this is where you want to be buried. This is equivalent to a Hindu who wants to have his ashes placed in the Ganga. This is the place to be buried because it is believed that if you're buried here, you will be raised from the dead with Imam Ali on Judgment Day.
Space yet to bury more?
Yeah, just get a little closer up. A lot of graves were added during the Iran-Iraq War, as you can imagine. Okay, a cemetery seems like a good place to end things. At least for now. So, and next week we'll be going to Istanbul, which some say isn't a Middle Eastern city, but that's debatable. It's at least the gateway between Europe and the Middle East, so, and a very rich city culturally, so we'll finish up visiting there. Okay, any thoughts, questions? The question I wanted to raise earlier, and I sort of mentioned it a little bit, was thinking back, and you're not supposed to do this because you can't change the past. Would it have been better, both politically for the United States and perhaps for much of the world, if Saddam Hussein would have been left in power? He was a brutal guy. He did a lot of brutal things, but there are a lot of brutal guys that we don't get rid of, maybe. But what were the results? Well, first of all, we had the chaos that created ISIS eventually, created Al-Qaeda Iraq. It brought Iraq much closer to Iran. And what's going on right today? Who's one of our main, quote-unquote, enemies? Iran. I guess, from what I read, that Biden's considering what he's going to do.
As a result.
But Iran is claiming, we didn't support, we don't support this. Yeah, we don't support it.
And it's called proxy. They don't officially call it, but they let people know, do what you need to do, and we'll give you the weapons, etc. But what if there was a barrier in there that was anti-Iran, namely Saddam Hussein? He fought a war against Iran. Now, I'm not suggesting by any means that it's just an interesting thing to contemplate. Sometimes you get what you don't really want. Sometimes it takes a little time to think things through. Yeah, Keith.
Well, allegedly they were looking for weapons of mass destruction, right? Colin Powell went before the United Nations and made a big speech. He was due. Yeah. But there are some people that would say, well, Saddam was saying to let the West think that. Whether we really knew or we really didn't, but he kind of furthered that tale.
Yeah, well, I'm not saying he was not a nice guy. Remember that he was very brutal, but so was the Tito in Yugoslavia, and once he went, all the faction. It's almost the better of two evils. Okay? Do you want a powerful guy that will keep all the others under control, even if it's done brutally, or do you want ethnic wars and all the factionalism that takes place?
Also, I think they sold it to the American people, the propaganda that we're killing those people that destroyed the World Trade Center and those towers, and no Iraqis had anything to do with it.
No, it had nothing to do with 9/11. In fact, Saddam Hussein would not have liked to bomb it, so, not at all. Okay.
In 1972, my husband was stationed in the Azores, and I needed a ride back to the United States, and I rode on an Iranian airplane. It cost me $5 for my bag lunch.
Okay.
And they were our allies.
Yes.
8 years before this war, what happened?
Well, we backed the Shah. We did not allow the elected government under the Prime Minister Mossadegh to take control of Iranian oil. That's what they did. And so we supported the Shah, and it led to the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini and the revolution, and yeah, and they got the oil in the long run.
It's such a complex history.
Oh, it is. It's, and again, you know, I never, you know, I'm a trained historian, and you're told not to second guess history, but I do it all the time because it's kind of fun, if nothing else, to just think, you know, that.
Today, our friends Saudi Arabia, which bombed us.
Yeah, if you want to look where the terrorists came from, they came from Saudi Arabia. And they were, as did Osama bin Laden. They were Saudis. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time, and hopefully.